Today's video is going to be more so where I've been since Tad's death. You'll see the video that's playing is actually the video that we had made by one of Tad's amazing therapists. And we played this video at his memorial service. So I'm deciding to use this as the visual while I tell, I guess, like how I've been since Tad's death and my experience with initial grief. And I do just want to start off by saying that this is in a very emotional experience I'm sharing, but this is also a very personal experience. While I am describing my child loss experience and my grief, this isn't to say that this is how other people feel or should feel, or that my timing on things should be compared to your timing of things. And I really want to stress the fact that grief is a very personal experience, and everybody's is uniquely different. I am sharing this story to just get more grief stories out there, but this isn't to be compared to anybody else's or to be used to compare to somebody else's journey. And the reason why I stress this is because in the beginning of my grief, I did constantly hear people kind of give me like guidelines of how I should be grieving, how long I should be grieving, how I should look when I'm grieving. And that's one of the main reasons why I do really want to share this very vulnerable and personal story, is because hearing those guidelines didn't help me. If anything, it almost prevented me from experiencing what I did experience. It's hard to kind of put it into words, but I truly believe that just like every child is different and every person is different, every relationship is different, when we associate that with grief and loss, it is the same amount of different. And so it's okay if you didn't feel any of these things, or if you did feel any of these things. And I strongly advise that if you know somebody that's going through grief, to use this as just kind of like a background noise of how somebody could be feeling. But never assume. And if you have somebody that is grieving, it's always better to just be honest and say you don't know how they're feeling, or you don't know how to show up for them. Because I do think a lot of pain happened in the beginning of my grief, because there was a lot of assumptions that were happening on my end and on other people's end. And in the beginning of your grief, it's just so foggy. So it can be really easy to accidentally hurt somebody's feelings, or, not say the right thing. And truthfully, even as I say all of these words, there is no right thing to say to somebody. I do think that there is a couple of like wrong things to say, but I don't think that there is a right thing to say or a right thing to do. I think the best way that we can love somebody who is experiencing grief or loss is to allow them to experience it however they feel fit. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about where I've been since my son's death, because I don't know. I feel like this part does need to be talked about, as much as I don't really want to talk about it. But these first few, well, it's almost been 3 years now, have been wild. I mean, I am quote unquote okay today, but it doesn't mean that I'm not still affected by grief and the immense pain and grief I still feel for the loss of my son physically. And I feel a need to say physically because that is something that is kind of key to me, is that I do feel like I've found a lot of my peace that I have because I feel like Tad is with me still, just in a different way. And that part of grief has been really complicated for me because when I lost Tad, it was literally like a bomb went off in my life. Every single tiny piece of my life was affected by the loss of him. It just was huge. Like, I think everybody can just like somewhat assume like, oh, losing your child is really heartbreaking. But it was ginormous. Like, it's just weird to think about how one Tuesday morning I woke up like normal with my baby and got him ready for the day and went to school, and then everything just changed. Like, it is still the wildest thing to fully acknowledge that one morning I just was a normal single mom going through nursing school for, trying to create a better life. And then I get a phone call and it's just over, just like that. Like, it's wild. But what's even more wild is that you can imagine how different life becomes all of a sudden, but you cannot imagine the silence that comes along with the absence of your person. It's just heartbreaking. Like, it's one of the worst things because it's like you live your life and you have these normalcies that are a part of you, and they do become a part of you. And my son required a lot of care, so I was always thinking about him, doing things for him, always. And so then when he just vanished, it was the adjustment of that was, I still cannot describe how torturous life became so quickly. I mean, it went from I was rushing around, going to school, checking the cameras, contacting his therapist, scheduling appointments, calling in for medications, to then just nothing. No one to come home to, no one to take care of, no noises, no alarms, no fear, no, it was just, it was like everything was gone. And when Tad was here, I was always on edge. I was always worried for his trach to come out. I was always worried he was going to get sick. I was always worried. And so when he just vanished, I didn't not worry anymore. It was just every thought that I used to have that went to Tad after he passed still went to Tad, but it was now followed by this devastating reminder he's dead. I cannot tell you how many times in those first few months my brain just kept having to say, he's dead. That day, those moments replayed in my... They replayed in my brain like a horror story. it was it was like my brain turned into the worst jail you could ever imagine. And there was no escaping it. My body just started to shut down. I mean, I was having these moments of complete shock where I just couldn't even process what was happening, to then the next moment I would remember or I would see something, and then my brain would think, "Where's Tad? He's dead." And it was like my brain started playing these really sick jokes on itself, and it was absolutely, it was terrifying. I mean, I had never until that point in my life ever wanted to like not alone. Have always been somebody that I enjoy my alone time. But after Tad died, I just couldn't trust myself to be alone, because when I was alone, the thoughts that were happening in my brain were just, it was not okay. And I was in nursing school and I knew somewhat of like what I was experiencing and going through. And, you know, we hear about the different phases of grief and, you know, denial. And, you know, I had just learned about it. It was being in nursing school, going through grief was definitely a double-edged sword. It had a lot of pros and it had a lot of cons. But, you know, I knew that if I admitted myself somewhere, that it wasn't going to look the greatest if I wanted to pursue some type of nursing. And so I was scared to go, you know, somewhere. I was scared that people would judge how I was feeling. And I started to judge how I was feeling. And it wasn't until I read this book called The Grieving Brain. And if you know somebody that's struggling with grief, I highly, highly recommend reading that book or gifting that book to somebody who's grieving, because it really helped me understand on a psychological level, like what my brain was trying to do. And it has a really special part in there where it basically says that our brain creates these love maps, where essentially, I think you can at any time think of like the top 3 loved ones in your life, and you basically know where they're at all times. And, you know, we get accustomed to that. And it dates back to like ancient times where we had to like, you know, keep track of our tribe and stuff. And so when we have somebody vanish like that, our brain is constantly searching for them. And so all of those thoughts and feelings that we're having were completely valid, but to experience that amongst trying to live life, you know, it wasn't like Tad died and then I got to just disappear for a while. You know, I was in nursing school and they're very strict about your attendance. I think I took 2 days off and that was all that I was allowed to have off. And, you know, I had to just go back to functioning with people and going to the grocery store. And, you know, I'm just walking amongst people and they don't know that, you know, last week my baby died. It's just, it's a hard thing because people were looking at me like I was normal on the outside, but they were not understanding all the things that were happening on the inside of my brain. And even more than that, in the spaces where people knew what I was going through, it became a very complicated environment, because while people loved me, and I know that they did and they wanted to support me, the unfortunate part is when you go through something and it affects somebody else, it affects them too. And so the way that they respond is sometimes a coping strategy for them as well as you. And it gets really complicated and messy when you have a very sensitive person going through something, but everybody around them is also going through it too. So it becomes very hard how to support each other when you're both going through really difficult things. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with emotions. And when my son died, I cried and I cried and I cried and I still cry. And a lot of times it wasn't even that I wanted to cry, but it was just my body was like experiencing this experience, which is why I really do believe that grief is not a feeling or an emotion, it is an experience, because the way that it just affects you if you allow it to is wild. I think about this day. I wish I didn't think about this day, but I think about this day often. But the day that I lost Tad was really hard for me, obviously. But one part that I never thought that I would think about during that day is the people that I traumatized around me. And not that I wanted to, but when I knew that Tad was gone in that ER, I had such a visceral reaction. I mean, it was like something I've never experienced before in my entire life, but my memory is like in and out, and I think I was kind of going in and out, but I just remember like literally falling to my knees and screaming in a way that I have never and would never want to. I mean, it wasn't something that I wanted to do, but it was just my body seeing my baby without his spirit. I knew he was gone. Nobody had to tell me anything. When I saw him, I knew. And when my soul realized that he was really gone, my soul just didn't know how to process it. And I think we stayed in that ER for about 5 hours, and I couldn't tell you how many panic attacks I had. I mean, at moments I just remember like falling to the ground, like screaming, "My baby's dead, my baby's dead." And, my aunt and my son's father were there, and I just remember them looking at me like I was literally crazy, but I just couldn't control myself. It was such a out-of-body experience that really just it did something to me. I don't know how to describe what it really did to me, but that day that Tad died, the day that his soul left here on earth, was the hardest day. Not because I lost my baby, because obviously that's hard, but there's just something about, I don't really know how to describe it, but when he left, my body ached for him, like to hold him. And it was a physical pain, and I still feel it sometimes. I still feel the aches and the physical pains of not being able to physically love my child. But it's forced me into this other side of life or spirituality where I do still have this super special connection with Tad. It's just different now, and I don't have as much control of it. I the truth is even when he was here, I was always along for the ride, but it's different now. But it kind of feels like he takes care of me now. And I still miss him, his physical body, but over these last 3 years, I feel like I've gotten to know him on a different level, and I'm really glad that he's free. And I'm really glad that he came here to spend time with me and to teach me everything he taught me and to love me as much as he loved me. Grief is an experience that has the power to really transform you. But the saddest thing that I've realized is that everybody around me was so scared for me to fully grieve, and so they kept trying to stop me. But just like I welcomed Tad with open arms here on Earth, I had to let him go open arms to wherever was the best place for him. And as a mom, you always want to be the safest place for your child, but that just wasn't the case for us. And I refuse to allow that to hinder our bond. But it has been something that has been really hard to experience, let alone explain. But my hope is that maybe somebody won't experience grief like this, or maybe they will, but by others talking about their experiences, grief just will no longer be some taboo emotion that is supposed to briefly happen after death. It's a lifetime of an experience if you allow it.